Good evening, everybody. It is currently 6:36 p.m. December 13th, 2024. By the way, the time is central. So, I guess welcome back. Reading Concept Rabbit by Jasper Fforde. Um, if you're looking for other chapters, they should be. You could find links in the description for the playlist, previous chapter, as well as if you're wanting to buy the book yourself to read it yourself, looking at the Amazon link. I don't make any money off of it. It's just I just post it because, well, author, just for support the author. Again, I don't do this for money. I don't do this to like further any sort of gain, like financially. I'm doing this because I just want to read a book and I need to do better about it. And I feel like I can do that. This kind of helps me to have a set schedule for it. Also, it's a bit more fun to read things out loud than it is to just do it in your head and like my brain gets jumbled and it gets all just distracted. But if I kind of put it out there, it doesn't get as distracted, if that makes sense. Anyways, so we're gonna get on with this one. This one's gonna be another short chapter, about maybe 6 pages, and yeah. So here we go. Oh yeah, voice is done. Or if dialogue is spoken, I speak in the accents because it's UK. But narration, I speak with this accent. So, yeah. Tough tots. Anyways, Griswold and Gossip. Because of their dislike of obsolescence, rabbits only chose obsolescence. No, rabbits only chose domestic appliances that would last a minimum of half a century. Dual-lit toasters were favored, as were Hoover-matic washing machines, vintage Kenwood chef food mixers, 70s push-button phones, treadle sewing machines, and large-format cameras. They loved wet chemistry photography. The older the process, the better. "How was work?" asked Pippa when I got home after the debriefing. Even to my own daughter, I had always maintained I was a low-level payroll accountant. I told someone I was a spotter once, and there had been consequences. I didn't want that again. So I couldn't tell her that of the 3 livestock we'd arrested, all had cover stories and plausible IDs, and no amount of coaxing would change their story. I couldn't tell her that their briefcases had contained sandwiches, 9 yo-yos, sachets of raspberry-flavored Angel Delight, and copies of Rabbit Vogue. Couldn't tell her that Lugless had applied to the senior group leader to use firmer methods to get them to talk, but had been overruled on the grounds of operational secrecy. I couldn't tell her that my sighting was now the only possible method of identification of Flopsy 7770. Couldn't tell her that tomorrow I would be staring at the bun shot of every lapsock we possessed until I found the one they were looking for. Couldn't tell her the reason I had been delayed was because the person who had to come pick up the whippet had been late. I had to sit with it for an hour while it quivered and stared at me while its sad, bulging eyes, like some thinned down canine version of Peter Lorre. Most notably, he played. Okay, never saw this movie, so sue me. He played Ugarte in Casablanca, one of the now forgotten stars of the silver screen. "Work was mundane as usual," I said. "What about you?" I was at I was doing a day of course. Sorry, I was doing a day course entitled "Why Spreadsheets Are Not Boring." So same as you, I guess. Pippa made supper after that, and true to form, Victor Mallet dropped round to see whether I'd found out where that rabbit had come from. I told him that as far as I could see, she was just passing through. "Doubtless a scam," said Victor with a grunt. "Rabbits are always on the make." "Was any of that true?" asked Pippa, once Victor had gone. "No, she lives in Leominster with her third husband. Not a word to Toby." "Right you are." Over the next 2 weeks, I spent all my office time trying to ID John Flopsy 7770, and by the end of a fortnight, I had got precisely nowhere, and had exhausted only 35% of the male lapstocks on record. 7770 might not even be on the books. Sorry, 7770 might not be on the books, said Fleming, eager to have me back on normal spotting duties. But Lugless spoke to the senior group leader and had me continue going through the bun shots and only rejecting those I was 76% certain weren't him. Lugless took being hoodwinked by his own kind as a deeply personal affront, especially as, to add insult to injury, someone had tied 2 knee-length gray socks to the rear bumper of his Eldorado, an obvious jab at his earless state, and making a mockery of his attempt to disguise himself. although personally I thought the eye patch and tam o'shanter bizarrely random, just bizarrely random enough to have worked. At the Buke Blitz that weekend, we gave Mr. Beaton a 20-second pause. Gave me a 20 seconds pause, as befitted his status as a generally reliable member of the team. Norman and Victor Millay kept an eager eye out for Connie's return while we were speed librarying, but she didn't turn up. So the brothers concluded I was right, just passing through. While I spent another fruitless week searching for a hint of the squash Tudor rose capillary ear pattern, Hemlock Towers opposite was being cleared of Mr. Beaton's effects. The good stuff was taken by his closest relatives. His library sold to Addimans and Hay-on-Wye. His arguably worthless knickknacks were picked through for value by his lesser relatives, and his meticulously researched 25-year project on the development of medium-density fiberboard was taken away in a skip to be recycled, ironically enough, into medium-density fiberboard. Hemlock Towers then stood empty once more, and gossip soon turned to who might become the new tenants. There were several false leads, of course. An Argentinian couple on the run from the police, someone who looked a lot like Rick Astley, a National Geographic photographer, a barrister convicted of embezzlement, a retired trapeze artist, someone else who looked like Rick Astley but did in fact turn out to be Rick Astley, another National Geographic photographer, unrelated to the first in an improbable coincidence. All came to naught, and it wasn't for another fortnight that word of the new tenants came to me by way of Mrs. Griswold, who, when she wasn't being a supremely lackluster Stanley Baldwin, ran the corner shop and post office. She was the village gossip, but didn't relinquish her skillfully wrought intelligence for free, and had her own unique exchange rate, something seriously juicy offered up to her altar of tittle-tattle. Could keep you in credit for weeks, but tired gossip already heard had no value at all. Luckily, I was in credit. I had overheard details of Mr. Beaton's last will and testament, and it appeared that Mrs. Silver, the housekeeper, was due for a considerable sum. Something that gave rise to suspicion after that her long-standing employment might have involved something more significant than just warm milk and dusting. Once this piece of information was taken, digested, tutted about, and then mentally filed, Mrs. Griswold beckoned me closer and hissed, "They're coming," in a particularly unsubtle manner. I looked out of the window to see whether the danger was imminent, but there was nothing to be seen. I concluded that the implied sense of threat was vague and intangible, the most dangerous kind to my mind. "Who?" "Them," she added, no more helpfully. "Vegans?" "No, not vegans," she said, eyes opening wide. "Worse than that." "Foreigners?" I asked, catching sight of that morning's copy of the Actual Truth, whose leader column's outrage du jour was that unwashed foreign beggars were taking much-needed panhandling jobs from their hard-working British counterparts. "Worse." "Vegan foreigners who are also socialists?" "No," she said, lowering her voice. "Rabbits." This startled Mr. Wainwright, who was leafing through the magazine display, part of his one-man quest to read in an 18-year run of Champion Marrow Monthly without once paying for a copy. "What's that?" he said. "Rabbits," repeated Mrs. Griswold, "in the village." Mr. Wainwright looked shocked and, I think, a little afraid. "Better not be some of those modern bullshit-in-your-face rabbits who'd like to cause trouble and have unrealistic views on equality." Actually, I thought to myself, any rabbit, even compliant, easygoing ones who kept themselves to themselves and didn't overbreed, would not find an easy home in Muke Hemlock. "They're off-colony legals," said Mrs. Griswold. "Major Rabbit is retired ex-army. There are 2 children, but I didn't hear what Mrs. Rabbit did. I'm not sure she even speaks English, to be honest. They were speaking in Rabbity when they walked in." "What about this Rabbity sound? What does this Rabbity sound like?" asked Mr. Wainwright. "Hymphy noises, mostly," said Mrs. Griswold. "Hymph, nymph, 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 that sort of thing. And a lot of nose and whisker movements." And they both laughed at Mrs. Griswold's impersonation of the rabbit. Nose wrinkled, upper teeth on lower lip, hands masquerading as ears. Mrs. Griswold was, however, quite wrong. All rabbits speak English, and owing to their traditional work in call centers, often 3 or 4 other languages too. At the bottom of the page it says, "Rabbits are good at languages as they are at much else. The average IQ of a rabbit is about 20% higher than that of humans, an indication that the event may have been partly satirical in nature. Okay. Alright, anyways. I heard they're moving into Mr. Beaton's old place, said Mrs. Ponsonby, who had caught the end of the conversation as she arrived. Waste of a good house, but someone else has to live in it. Hello, Peter. Mrs. Ponsonby was my aunt, and had an odd habit of contradicting herself in every sentence. Pippa called it a demonstration of the duality of our species. I called it just plain annoying. They must have come into some serious cash, said Mr. Wainwright, to afford the old Beaton place. If they have, they'll probably blow the lot on lettuce, said Mrs. Ponsonby, adding, but that would be their choice. I think Mrs. Rabbit's name was Constance, said Mrs. Griswold. What? I said. Constance, she replied. I never heard of a rabbit called Constance. I had, and it stood no reason Connie and Constance were the same rabbit, and I suddenly felt a little odd inside. A sense of interest, obviously, that I might be seeing her more regularly after all these years, but also a sudden paralyzing fear that she might find out what I did for a job. But I was having a conflicting moment right now. It suddenly got a whole lot worse and was very quick, and it was getting a whole lot worse and very quickly. I heard she was the widow of that rabbit mistakenly judged by Two Legs Good, said Mrs. Griswold, and it felt as though iced water had been suddenly pressed into my veins. I never connected the two. Oh, I never connected the two. Why should I? But the truth was that I was partially responsible for Dylan Rabbit's death, even if the Compliance Task Force was not the agency that killed him. He was released by Rapcot within 24 hours and dead in another 5. Two Legs Good activists dragged him from his house in the middle of the night and upended him in a 40-gallon drum of cheap gravy that had been seasoned with bay leaves, celery, thyme, juniper berries, and red wine. Jesus Christ. Okay. The mistake was only discovered when the rabbit we were actually after died of myxomatosis 3 months later. Controversially, the BBC's News and Views had suggested that the Rabbit Compliance Task Force had tipped off Two Legs Good and had released him only to be killed as a warning. The senior group leader vehemently denied the accusation as just another manufactured lie from the biased pro-rabbit media. As it turned out, Dylan's family, which I was now aware included Connie, obviously, were fully compensated and even given off-colony status. The senior group leader remarked that the whole debacle was probably the best result this family could have hoped for. A canicular plumber could never have earned enough to buy his way off colony. But all that aside, Connie's and my shared university attendance was a long time ago, so there was a very good chance she'd forgotten all about me. After all, she didn't appear to recognize me at the library, and even if she did remember me, she'd never know I was a spotter, less no one who'd had a hand in the death of her second husband. Will they be trying to get the kids into the local school? Asked Mrs. Ponsonby, adding, waste of time if you ask me, but everyone needs an education. I think that's what they're here for. That's what they're here for, replied Mrs. Griswold, checking it out. Plus sizes, vegan options, that sort of thing. Carrot-munching pests. Who should have been smothered when they spoke their first word, grumbled Mr. Wainwright, whose social filters, if he'd ever had any, were now entirely absent. It's unnatural. He was right on that score. The spontaneous anthropomorphizing event was completely unnatural and totally unprecedented. On the 12th of August 1965, there had been an unexpected flurry of snow on the night of a full moon following the warmest of summer days, when the sunset glowed an eerie shade of green. Aluminum foil had inexplicably tarnished within 10 miles of the event, and glass had adopted a sheen like that of mineral oil on water. The 18 rabbits of the event morphed and grew into semi-human-like shape overnight, stretched, yawned, then asked for a glass of water and a carrot, adding, but really only if it's no trouble. The 55th anniversary would be later on this summer, but it was unlikely anyone would celebrate, least of all the rabbits to whom the event elicited mixed feelings. Some thought humanness a boon, others a lament. Most agreed on one thing, however. It was better to have a mind capable of philosophizing over the question of their existence than not. And chocolate eclairs. They were definitely worth having. Well, well, I said, taking a deep breath and making to leave. I dare say Mr. Millay and his brother have already formed an action committee. Those Malays, said Mrs. Griswold. Those Malays, Mrs. Griswold fondly looking down, said Mrs. Griswold fondly, looking down and touching her hair absently. Always so concerned about our welfare. And that is the chapter. Next chapter will be Pippa and Pasta. So, yeah, that's it. I'll try to get it done tomorrow. This book is about 300 pages, and we're 1/6 of the way through. Yeah, no, we're more than 1/6. We're almost a fifth. So, thank you all for being here and for watching or listening or whatever you're doing. Regardless, hope you all have a great rest of your day, and like, comment, all that fun stuff. Subscribe, I don't care. Yeah, thank you. Have a great day. And again, The Constant Rabbit by Jasper Fforde. Boom. All right. Have a great night.